Do you have a favorite?
Not meant to. But mostly the unloved ones, the unvisited ones, the cases that get dusty and ignored. All the broken and shunned creatures. Someone's got to care for them. Who shall it be if not us?
Yes.
Welcome to Rune Soup, a weekly podcast about magic, culture, and the very best new and old ideas for living in this world. Coming to you from 43 degrees south on a small farm in deepest Tasmania. My name is Gordon, and I shall be your host. This week, we welcome to the show Brandt Stickley. Brandt is, among other things, assistant professor in the College of Classical Chinese Medicine, visiting professor at Dragon Riser's College of Oriental Medicine, acupuncturist, herbalist, and a classical Chinese medical practitioner working in the Portland area. He joins us today to talk about classical Chinese medicine, obviously, but in the particular context of what its insights might provide for more holistic, spirit-inclusive healing modalities in general. A fascinating and timely discussion. Enjoy. Brandt, welcome aboard.
Thanks. Glad to be here.
Yeah. Going to be a good chat, but you're a first-time guest, which means you get the traditional first-time question, Brandt. Were you a weird kid?
Was I a weird kid? Well, it's funny. I would say unequivocally. And the first, and this will become relevant as we go along, I think, but like maybe one of the first memories that I have is being at our big kitchen table with my 5 brothers and sisters and saying, I was probably like 3 years old or something, and saying like, I can dream anytime I want, and I can see anything I want whenever I want. And my brother saying, I don't think that's really possible. And then going on to just describe this kind of like eidetic phenomena. And that's like kind of par for the course in a way. And then, years later, I woke up and there's John the Baptist standing at the end of my bed and offering me honey from a honeycomb. And I was probably in like 4th grade at that time. And I
Did
think
you grow up in like a very saint-heavy Catholic family or anything?
Actually, no. It's funny because I grew up as an Episcopalian, and then I was going to probably about the time right towards the end of that period in 4th grade, I said to my parents, like I was going to this kind of very loose school, and I was like, I think I need more discipline. And so I ended up going to Catholic school, and then I went to Catholic school for the rest of my high school career. And like around that 5th grade period, like I just was like really heavily into saints. And at the same time, I was the youngest of 5. And so I had this kind of like Jack Kerouac On the Road. Like I probably read On the Road when I was in 4th grade or something like that. And so I had this like very clear kind of interest that was just in me that also had this faculty for seeing things, I guess you could say.
So, the John the Baptist is associated with a bunch of things. It's weird, like as an adult, you can kind of play with or go in and out of those symbols, right? Like, because he's not associated with honey in a honeycomb, but you can look at it and go, actually, that's itself a really interesting archetype. So, like, what did you think at the time, maybe versus what do you think now? That was about.
Well, at the time, I really felt like, oh, this is some kind of an initiation, and I don't know what it is. And it's kind of cool. Like, I wasn't terrified of it at all. It was like really kind of part and parcel of my interest in such matters. And it almost didn't even come as much of a surprise to me. In retrospect, having gone through, I mean, to me, of course, the headlessness aspect, which I really encountered in your work, most clearly articulated. The headlessness and the precursor and drawing down the sun and all of these aspects all make sense to me now.
Yeah. Well, so honey and honeycomb are associated with, in a Greek sense, but probably from like the late Stone Age in and around the Mediterranean, with a similar kind of initiatory liminality, because in the wild you would find hives in cave mouths. So that's where you'd most likely go and harvest honey. And that's probably where the sort of archaic Hecatean bee angle comes from, right? So it's kind of your fourth or fifth grade self wasn't too far off, like
right,
the great initiator. And it's sort of like a double initiation symbol, because John the Baptist baptizes, hence the name Christ. He brings the Spirit of God down into a physical form, and that's sort of what honey in a honeycomb is. It's that same like not coagulation's too gross a word for it, but a solidification of the doorway. So kind of that's a good one to have.
Yeah. Well, so and then again, it's like there you have this kind of really one of the central approaches that informs Chinese medicine for me so profoundly is like looking at centers, looking at roots and branches, looking at centers and peripheries, and within that the liminality that's inherent within those multiple centers. When you start to perceive not just a center and a periphery, but multiple centers with multiple peripheries and how they're interacting, in the way that Christopher Alexander talks about that as what constitutes a perceptible quality of life. Are you familiar with Christopher Alexander's?
I am, from a permaculture perspective.
Okay. Well, so if you get the chance, you should check out his rugs book. Like, his rugs book is phenomenal, because basically he's saying, in essence, I have this collection of rugs, and I would show them to people and ask them which of these rugs is more alive. And what he found was, time and time again, people were choosing the same ones, and that what they were reacting to was this kind of interplay of centers and peripheries, of multiple nested centers and peripheries.
I like it. Yeah. It's funny you mentioned that, because Dan Palmer, who's the host of Making Permaculture Stronger and a big Christopher Alexander proponent, from kind of, he's correct about this. Permaculture is a design science without a theory of design. And so he's done a lot of work over a decade or so of kind of seeing where Christopher Alexander's work can help in providing methods of thinking with design and living systems. And that's kind of what we're talking about here, right? And I'm actually going to be talking to him with my Permaculture Tasmania hat on in a couple of weeks. So I'm going to try and find that rug book and get deep into it then. It's a useful weaving together.
Great, so to speak.
Exactly. All right, so let's go back to the kid who got initiated by a honeycombed JTB and take the story from there.
Well, so, one of the other aspects of that is that pertains to my journey to Chinese medicine is that I also, as a kid, had horrible migraines, like also from the same period on, weekly horrible migraines, and almost up through most of my teenage years, and then kind of dissipated when I moved out, and then suddenly, and became like kind of sporadic, and then suddenly many years later, when I started acupuncture school, literally on the first day that I went to palpate a person's body, like the migraines came back, and I was having those weekly migraines again. And I think that's, and I see that now as being like so intimately related to the nervous system just being overwhelmed by sensory input. And until I found a way through Chinese medicine, I found a way to channel that capacity that helped to dissipate that alone helped to dissipate the migraines.
This is a sort of, it's sometimes a dangerous oversimplification to say it this way, but it's the kind of shamanic initiation, right? Like there aren't too many people, I think, who end up in healing modalities that don't get there, not necessarily in a physician heal thyself way, like first you must heal yourself and then go and heal others, but more that it's more circular than that, isn't it? Like people find themselves in that, and if they hadn't found it, then they wouldn't have fixed it. But if they hadn't have fixed it, then the life would have, and you can't really unpick it. But you and those modalities, I don't know, the symptoms are kind of co-present with where that cure goes. It's really, really interesting stuff. Is that something you typically observe?
Yeah, absolutely. And then the biggest part of that is the multivalence of it, right? Like the more that we're capable, Chinese medicine is basically like a pattern medicine. And the more that we're capable of perceiving the nodes in that web of patterning, so that everything is, nothing can be, oh, it's like cause and effect, clear cut cause and effect, this happened, this happens. That in fact, we can perceive how there are these cycles that are happening in the body, which in a sense are what really qi is a way of describing, the term qi is a way of describing how time interacts with the physiology. And it does so in multiple ways. And that's a way of describing the channel system in the body, is like how many ways different signatures of time interact with the human body. And within that, there are certainly structures, right? There's aspects of our physiological experience, or, I'm a 48-year-old person, and there's a part of me that's showing up as the totality of myself as a 48-year-old person in the context of what will prove to be the whole scope of my life. And at the same time, I'm also presently like digesting my dinner, and I'm also presently in a relationship to the seasonal cycles that are playing out right now. I'm also incidentally in relation to some virus potentially. And all of those things exist within this greater sphere through which there are cycles that are governed by 7 or 8 year patterns, which are aspects of my growth and birth and maturation and decline and ultimately death. And those are operative at the same time. And any vulnerability that can present itself upon which the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune can express themselves is the potential for there to be the development of a condition. From that, we look at the terrain and what is the nature of the terrain and what is the nature of the stress. And we can then see how is that going to manifest first as even something simple like an upper respiratory infection that will ultimately be the one that becomes your cancer 30 years later.
I like it.
And we can see it.
Yeah. Is that so? I mean, this is jumping around a bit, but in a good way. This is a challenging question, I suppose, but is it possible to kind of like, you mentioned pattern logic or pattern awareness is a better term. Is it possible at all to briefly describe like the basic perspective or tenets of like traditional Chinese medicine, or is that it? Is it like it's a language of pattern awareness? Is that like, what else? Is there things we would add to that?
Well, so that moves through one of the basic patterns that you can articulate is that life expresses itself through pattern and number. So we have, Chinese medicine has a foundational text, and that's called the Yellow Emperor's Classic, or the Huangdi Neijing. And this is comprised of two parts. One is called the Su Wen, simple questions, and one is called the Ling Shu, which is the spiritual pivot. And so those two books together comprise the Neijing, and that's where the fundamental concepts of Chinese medicine are recorded. And this is like kind of Warring States Han Dynasty period, so like around 220 AD or something, about that period, we could say. So the most fundamental concept of Chinese medicine is based upon yin and yang. And Chinese medicine, like all traditional medicines, really truly demonstrates how medicine is applied philosophy. Right. So one of the descriptions of medicine is that it's applied philosophy. And how that becomes adjacent to magic is like applied cosmology. And the two of them together necessarily inform one another. So the fundamental basis of Chinese medicine, as I phrase it, is there's only one pathology. And that pathology is going against the flow of the numinous. It's going against the flow of working with life and affirming life and moving towards the further expression of life. So that's the fundamental concept. And within that, the movement of yin and yang is best understood as a constant expansion and contraction, which is the breath moving through the cosmos and manifesting everything within it. So through the expansion of yang and the contraction of yin, you have this process moving into greater and greater degrees of adaptive complexity and expressing itself through, as a common Chinese phrase, is through the 10,000 things. So there's an extremely famous line from the Tao Te Ching that says, the Tao gives birth to one gives birth to two gives birth to three gives birth to the 10,000 things. So if you can imagine that process of expansion and contraction, it starts out from an undifferentiated oneness. It then expands to become yin and yang. It then coalesces back into the number 3, where there's a relationship between heaven, earth, and man, and human beings. It then spreads out at 4 to the 4 directions. The 4 directions then orient themselves around a center and create the number 5. And so that's the number of physical yin substantial organs that are described in Chinese medicine. Next, you go from 5, you expand. Now, if you imagine that that's a wheel with a center in it, imagine like the number 5 as 4 directions with the center in it. And then you introduce movement into that. You take that wheel and you spin it. Then that's 6. And at 6, you have yin and yang interacting with, yin and yang is 2, interacting with heaven, earth, and man. So it means the 6 channels, or the 6 times 2, the 12 channels that we use in Chinese medicine for acupuncture, the regular channels, are the manifestation of yin and yang expressing itself in the form of a human being in time and in interaction with the environment and the timing within that environment. And that goes on through 6, 7, 8, and 9. 6 is the very important one for me, because that becomes the basis of the herbal medicine, which is expressed in the first major formula text in China, which is called the Shanghan Lun, which is the treatise on damage by cold. And that's the book, that's the text that informs all of my herbal medicine. Like, that's the basis of my herbal medicine. I really hardly use any other text because it's the fundamental one, and it's the text that has a shared lexicon with the Neijing. It has a shared that anytime I read a word in the Shanghanlun, I can trace that back to a statement in the Neijing and contextualize it through that, and understand its meaning in that context through how it appears in another text. And because that's also occurring at the same time as the Tao Te Ching and Zhuangzi, then I can take, and in a sense the I Ching too, I can take any word from any one of those things and see how it connects to some really actionable herbal formula that I can take to address a condition.
So it's a technical hermetica from China.
Exactly.
I like it. Coming back to the six, so I'm thinking of the I Ching and hexagrams and so on. Is this because a lot of the stuff that available is a weird word. A lot of the stuff that maybe in non-Chinese contexts we're aware of, like the I Ching and so on, emerge from this same kind of philosophy. Is that why there are like six is a big deal across a bunch of things in a Chinese cosmology? That's question one. Question two is there's some really interesting overlap with Pythagorean numbers, right?
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things that I find compelling about Chinese modes is that although the Yellow Emperor is, as you say, about 220 AD written down,
right?
It's a kind of gathering up of and putting into words of a cosmology that goes back, who knows, right?
Right. Well, so the I Ching is a great example because there's an incredible website called Sino-Platonic Papers, which is run by a University of Pennsylvania professor, Victor Mayer, and he's a prolific translator and has this great interest in kind of like the mummies of Urumqi and these mummies that have been found in far western China, and has explored that in great depth. And on that website, there's a paper by, I think the author's name is Julie, I think it might be Julie Wei, where she talks about the Proto-Indo-European roots of the names of the trigrams in the I Ching. So in other words, the example that I often give is the trigram that correlates to thunder is in the I Ching called Germ. And that's not the Mandarin word for thunder. This is clearly an older attribution. But if you take the word Germ and trace that through to its Proto-Indo-European roots, you see it's like that the Jun of Jun and the Thun of thunder are the same, right? They're coming from the same root. And that's some of the origins of the world's mythologies.
Yeah.
Evidence too, right? That's part of it. And we can see that. And the thing is, the closer we can get. So the reason I focus on the classical texts is because the closer I can get to a coherent lexicon that obviously points towards something from a much deeper oral tradition and carries that through into written form, that's where my interest lies, right? And so, and it's just like the way that I became devoted to this text, the Shanghanlun, the way that I became devoted to it was I was very interested in it. And I had this patient that came to see me, and she came in and she complained of basically like every 14 days she would have like a flu-like state, and she would have dizziness, and she would have a bitter taste in her mouth, and she would have alternating fever and chills. And anyone who knows a little bit about Chinese medicine can name that, right? That's like a Xiao Chai Hu Tong pattern. That's a Shaoyang pattern. And so it was almost like a no-brainer for me to give her this formula. She comes back a week later and she says, "Oh yeah, completely cleared up my symptoms, but now I have this weird sensation in my joints." And in that moment, I hear this I hear this other formula name, like audibly hear this other formula name. So I don't even really know that formula, but I run to the text of the Shanghailun, and I look it up, and it says, when you give Xiao Chai Hu Tong, a patient will complain of a sensation in their joints, and then so you give Chai Hu Guizhi Tong. And that was the formula that I had heard. And so here I find myself in relation to this text and it communicating to me. And not only communicating to me, but it's self-predicting how a patient was going to respond to the formula that I gave.
Love it. This actually brings up a good point. We didn't actually get to how you kind of went into practice. You sort of mentioned like, oh, when I started acupuncture. I'm like, well, hang on, let's take that story. Like, because when was the first time maybe you don't have a memory of like the first time you either encountered the word or the concept, and did you know at the time that was going to take over your life, that kind of stuff?
Literally the first so I went to Cornell and studied English literature and Asian studies, and graduated from there and was trying to figure out what I was going to do with my life. And about that time, I literally heard of acupuncture for the first time. So this was like 1994 or something. Literally heard of acupuncture for the first time. I thought, that's really fascinating. And the person that was telling me about it said, oh, well, you have to actually be an MD to do it. And I was like, well, I'm not doing that. And then never thought about it. So after graduating, my wife and I were getting married the next year. And so I got this job working in the Cornell library, where my job was shelving. I mean, it was one of the most incredible jobs I've ever had, shelving books in the largest library on the Cornell campus. And I was in the Asian library. And one of the tasks that I was charged with was moving all of the medical holdings in the Asian library out of the stacks and into storage. And around that time, I just decided that I was going to study. I became really interested in kind of post-1978 Chinese poetry. And so I figured out that the only place that anybody was really doing any work on that was at UC Berkeley. So I went out to UC Berkeley to study Chinese with the interest of ultimately studying like post-1978 poetry. During that time, while I was living in Berkeley, I got this job working for the Institute of Buddhist Studies, which was like a Shin Buddhist seminary. And so during that time, I was studying Chinese in the morning, going to work at the Institute of Buddhist Studies, going back to class in lunchtime, going back to work, and then staying up all night, like basically copying out characters. And I had to take classical Chinese. And when I had to take classical Chinese, I was like, okay, forget about the post-1978 stuff. Like, this is where it's at. And I happened to have had received acupuncture from a fellow student during that period. And it was just like this, it blew my mind. It was such an incredible experience. And so shortly after that, a lot of things fell apart. My job moved and I didn't move with it. And my wife was like, hey, we came out here for you to study Chinese. Like, maybe you should think about what you want to do. So I literally laid down on a futon in a apartment, which had the front door in Berkeley and the back door in Oakland. And I laid on this futon and laid there for like a week. And at the end of that week, I wrote a list. I literally wrote a list of like, okay, this is what I want to do. And it was like film school, like journalism
Well,
school.
you really did not want to make money. Holy shit.
I know, right? Like all these things. And then at the bottom of the list, it was like acupuncture. And I was like, oh, that's what I want to do. That's it. So I figure out how to go to acupuncture school. I had to take a couple science classes. I call up the school after having taken a couple science classes. I went to the American College of Traditional Chinese Medicine in San Francisco. I called them up and I said, "Hey, I'm just checking in on my prereqs. I only need anatomy and physiology." And they were like, "Well, we're offering that now. Why don't you start Monday? If you can get your application and come on Monday and we'll work it out." And so basically that's how I started acupuncture school. And
were
literally,
were you aware, because you had the sort of mystic experiences in Catholic school? It's a very unusual journey, beginning with Cornell and having these Chinese medical books going from the stacks into storage, and then all the kind of weird stuff on the West Coast. Were you aware that something was going on? I mean, did the sort of mystic, or even Mia, not that it's any different, Jungian perspective, were you aware something was going on as all of these over the course
absolutely,
of
right? So as a matter of fact, like as it happens, the reason that I ended up doing Asian studies in my undergrad was because there was a visiting professor there who was a specialist in the Thai forest tradition. And like that Thai forest tradition is so magical, like so profoundly magical, as you see from like the Thai occult, like those Thai occult books that have come out, right? That's what those forest monks were partially doing, was that work. And so that's how I got involved with the Asian studies. And I was taking courses with her where we were reading these texts. It was like basically anthropology courses where we were reading these texts, the autobiographies of the monks. And it was kind of like a survey course of first like Westerners that had studied Buddhism and their memoirs, and then like the memoirs of the actual practitioners with a particular focus on the Thai forest tradition. So I'm like sitting meditation all the time through this process, right? So it's like that's part of the awareness of it. I have that awareness in mind, and this, it's just that the synchronicities kind of just were coming fast and furious, basically. So I was really pretty cognizant of it and inviting it. You know what I mean? It's like that's one of the biggest things is like this concept of the siddhis, and how like the siddhis are not something you should seek through your meditation practice. But the fact is, if you're meditating that much and you're not having the siddhis, you're not having these heightened states of consciousness, you're not having clairvoyance and clairaudience and all of it, you're doing something wrong. And the idea that there's some kind of like pristine meditative practice that wasn't for this worldly ends, it just doesn't bear out on the ground.
Yeah.
And so medicine is just a part of that. Chinese medicine can be a part of that. Like an example of that is like there's a book called The Fourth Uncle in the Mountain, which is about a young Vietnamese child who's taken in by a Buddhist abbot who's a profound healer and teaches him healing. And now what's even more interesting about that is that if you read that book and you think, oh, well, this is, it was like if you think of that as a kind of normative Buddhist practice, the truth is that his grandfather, the abbot, was actually part of a millenarial hill tribe cult that was semi-animist, semi-Buddhist. And, that's the same region through which all of the Thai forest monks were freely moving through the jungles, practicing medicine, teaching, reading, like, performing performing at festivals and all of it.
Yeah, very cool.
So
Go on.
Well, the next thing is I start school. I literally go to class. I go to class. They pull me out to interview me and accept me, and I go back to class, and that's the beginning of my career. A week later, I go into the library and I pull this book off of the shelf called Dragon Rises Redbird Flies by Leon Hammer, who is my mentor and who became my mentor. I read that book, and it's called Dragon Rises Redbird Flies, Psychology and Chinese Medicine. I read that book, and that was my life's work laid open in front of me. Like, I knew in that moment, this is my life's work. And
Amazing.
so while I'm in school, I start studying this pulse system, which Dr. Hammer learned from his teacher named Dr. Shen. And that was my first connection with Dr. Hammer. Like, after reading the book, I then started studying his pulse system. And then about a year after that, I started working directly with Dr. Hammer. I started studying with a teacher named Brian LaForgia, who actually at that time was living in Tasmania and flying back to San Francisco to teach. And so I threw myself into that study of pulse diagnosis, that specific form of what we call Shen Hammer pulse diagnosis. So about a year after that, I was working with Dr. Hammer when he would come out to San Francisco to teach. And then after I graduated, I went to China. I graduated a little bit early, about a semester early. And so I went to China and worked in a hospital. And then when I came back, Dr. Hammer had moved from upstate New York down to Florida. And so he invited me to move down to Florida to start teaching at a school that he had established there, that he had sort of taken over there. So that's how I got started teaching Chinese medicine.
Nice one. No, that's as you say, you kind of know when the life's work shows up. But I think you mentioned something about the technique, the diagnostic technique used. And this is probably an interesting point to make about Chinese medicine, is that it's sort of a cosmology in which, correct me if I'm wrong here, but it's a cosmology in which the sort of agreement is it kind of like how the universe works, but the actual way of how to say this, it's almost like there's more lineage traditions within it about how different healing modalities are applied and used, and they don't necessarily, they don't line up in the same way a Western allopathic medical school will, where you kind of like everyone agrees on anatomy and this, and you kind of go through the steps. It's more, you live in a universe that is described philosophically,
Yeah,
and then
well,
it's
so
applied.
exactly.
Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, and now there have been great pains through in a sense, through the influx of a relatively materialist framework to try to create a Chinese medicine sort of post-communist era, to create a Chinese medicine
This is going to be one of my questions. How is it fair to communism?
That would conform to that. Now, it's easy to make that a straw man, and say, oh, it's all materialistic. In the meantime, there's these still family lineages that are sort of subterranean and are ultimately taking expression now. So I don't want to, I'm not trying to disparage the medicine as it's practiced in China, because that's equally profound. But it's very much like lineage based, and there are part of that is both the transmission of technical skill and diagnostic framework, but also really a view, like a capital V view of the medicine. Like, all of those can be present within a specific lineage. And then, of course, there's an author named Volker Scheid who's written a book called Currents of Tradition in Chinese Medicine, which happens to be about the lineage of which I am a part, the Meng He Ding lineage. But he also goes into great detail talking about the political and social forces that also inform what makes a lineage a lineage. Right. So that too admits of all of this kind of like multivalent qualities.
Is it a fair statement to say, however, that because communism is materialist, the stuff that it's almost, I was thinking about this in the context of it being a diaspora worldview in a way, right? Because if with the rise of communism in China, because of Marx and Mao and everyone's opinion on things like religion, it also kind of got or unhaunted, at least on an acceptable basis. So there's a sort of it didn't fare well. The spirits inside TCM didn't fare quite so well under communism either. But it's my understanding that in kind of like diaspora, that because that's less of an issue, it's you can find it there as well. Does that make sense?
It's intact. Yeah, that's true. That's true. And there's no way, like, there's no way of understanding Chinese medicine without understanding the role of recognizing the role of the spirits, which are contained or thesaurized in the organs. But you can view that as a from a strictly psychological perspective, or you can even view that from a material perspective and not accept it from a spiritual perspective.
And is that what's happened? Is it the shut up and calculate model?
That's right. There's a lot of that. There's definitely a lot of that.
So you've worked in, I mean, it may have been a while ago, but you've worked in Chinese hospitals. Was it your impression that, say, for instance, some of the older patients were still living in the spirit cosmology, even if their doctors are kind of like not having those discussions in a treatment setting? Do you know what I mean?
Well, I would argue that, so the Neijing itself is trying to establish this very naturalistic mode of medicine. And there's statements within it that disparage spiritual healing or healing through invocation, or say that it's like something that was possible in the past, but not possible now. But the truth is all of those have coexisted and they continue to coexist, and they're still present in China, even in spite of that there are a lot of people practicing cookie cutter medicine, but there are also a lot of people not doing that.
Yeah.
I mean, that's my experience. And in the current milieu, right, there's this renaissance of classical studies led by really spearheaded by an author named Liu Lihong, who has he wrote a book called Si Kao Zhong Yi, which is like contemplating Chinese medicine, which was all about the classical worldview and how we had to reclaim it in medicine. That's been translated into English now by the founder of the program that I teach in now here in Portland.
Oh, very cool. Because it sort of occurred to me as I was putting the questions together, I didn't realize you worked in Chinese hospitals, so you're the perfect person to ask in many ways. Given, what happened in Wuhan a couple of months ago and how it's overwhelmingly older people. And I kind of want to ask a question of how do you think they thought about what was going on or what was happening to them? And also and the wider question to follow up with after that is this, how we see breath and lungs. How does Chinese medicine, we touched on it briefly, understand breath and lungs? Because those are the sort of, I don't want to use war terminology, but those are like the battlefields or the theaters of interaction du jour, I guess.
Right. Well, so, the fundamental thing is, again, that Chinese medicine as a medicine that recognizes the relationship between stress and terrain also recognizes that one of the most obvious influences upon the decline of the terrain is age. And within that can be rooted, that's, discussed as an aspect of the kidney essence. And the kidney essence also has an intimate relationship. It's the foundation of all things. It's the foundation of, right, the question of you can contract a problem in your lungs, but you're not going to die until it's reached your kidney, so to speak. And in some cases, literally true, right? In some cases, biomedically, that is the case. In other cases, it's true, but not in a biomedical way. So the decline of aging is associated with the decline of the kidney yang and the kidney essence. And that renders one vulnerable. That means every problem starts at the periphery. Every problem starts at the point of contact, and then it moves into the most vulnerable area. It moves into the most vulnerable strata of function in the body until it's resolved, until it's harmonized, until the function of that aspect of the body is brought back into its natural function. So it's never a question of there's this thing that I have to get out. It's like I have to render this terrain inhospitable to whatever got in via restoring its natural function. Like that's the fundamental, one of the fundamental aspects that distinguishes a potentially salutogenic model, B, a truly non-allopathic model, a non-oppositional to some germ model. And that, as it happens, the formulas that have been most commonly integrated into practice alongside Western medical knowledge, a vast majority of them are the formulas that are described in the Shanghan Lun, in the treatise on cold damage that I described earlier.
Mm. It's probably worth talking, because I know you watched the discussion I had with Connor and Danny the other day, and one of the things that came up was terrain theory, and I was watching the chat, and I don't think people are aware. Well, some people weren't sure what it was, like terrain theory versus germ theory, and it seems to me that this is probably something. If you listen to this going, well, I don't know this either. So everyone knows germ theory in the sense that Pasteur said there are these invisible little beasties that cause illness, and that sounded radical. And it was the classic story, and it's not that this is wrong necessarily, was doctors would be performing autopsies and then go and deliver babies, and because they had the invisible beasties from the dead corpses, the corpses, then they would sort of infect the mothers and the babies would die, and the mothers would die, and so on, right? And eventually,
and it's, I think it's apocryphal, but supposedly Pasteur on his deathbed was like, it's the terrain.
Yeah, there was that. He did kind of apparently falsify some things mm-hmm. that was found out, I think, in Germany or somewhere in the early in like the 20s. But that's the general idea. He came up with it, but it was, there was an opposition idea which was called terrain theory, right?
Right, like actually, the internal milieu.
Yeah,
the internal milieu.
So tell people that.
So now, what that means is it's not so much the nature of it in the Shanghan Lun, as I said, there's one pathology, and that is not flowing properly. The second part of that is that there are aspects that are excitatory, and we call that wind, and there are aspects that are inhibitory, and we call that cold. Now, within that, any insult to the physiology is either going to be excitatory or inhibitory. And it comes into contact with the body, and the body at its surface, which is what we call the taiyang, the body at its surface is capable of allowing in what should come in and keeping out what should stay out. So that's the as far as terrain goes, that is the point of contact with things in the environment. Now, those things in the environment, right? Cold refers to anything that inhibits the unfolding complexity of yang interacting with its environment, of life itself interacting with the environment. And that necessarily starts at the surface, but anywhere that there's a vulnerability within the body, it will move. If it gains purchase at the surface, it will move into that terrain. Now, if that terrain has been compromised, it could have been compromised by any number of things. So like an aspect of, on the one hand, like a very deep aspect of function is the circulatory function. And that's associated very strongly with the liver and what we call Jue Yin. And that's conceived in some models as one of the deepest strata of the body. If that's what's vulnerable, then something comes in, it moves into its counterpart, and then if it can, it will go into that terrain. Now, the things that compromise that terrain are anything that's come about to inhibit the circulation. Anything that's come about to inhibit, right, at the level of the circulation, of yin and yang within the circulation, as the circulatory system functioning through expansion and contraction, that's literally a description of how blood circulates. It circulates through the constriction and the expansion and contraction of the blood vessels. And if that's healthy, then your hands and feet are warm, you're full of blood, blood carries awareness, blood carries warmth, blood carries oxygen, and vital health is dependent upon the circulation of that blood. If that's compromised, what starts out as a simple, what starts out as a virus coming into your lungs goes into your circulatory system, because that's where the vulnerability is. Now, think about how circulation to function has to move against gravity. And in moving against gravity, I actually was lecturing about this today. In moving against gravity, that is the capacity to say no. It's the capacity to assert oneself in contrast to the forces that would restrain you. Right? So that's like a luciferic mode within the body. The capacity to say enough and no, and in a sense to assert the self through the negative. That's the function that correlates to the circulation, because it's moving against gravity. And so anything that inhibits you, so in your family, if every time you go to assert yourself by distinguishing yourself from what's around you, if that's met with humiliation, or that's met with physical abuse, that renders that aspect of your physiology vulnerable. And that means that you have a vulnerability at the level of the circulation. Right? I think Danny was saying about PTSD and how it manifests in the joints. That's how it manifests in the joints.
Yeah, this is something I think is super important. Is one of the discussions we had in medicine songs was the relation between disease, emotion, and meaning, because the sort of, I guess, going back to terrain and germ theory, germ theory is what, in particular, 20th century medicine built itself on, Rockefeller medicine, and that's where the idea of vaccines and things come from. So it's a battlefield approach of I will patch you up and send you back off into the gunfire that's causing all of everyone's illnesses anyway. And again, the logic behind, it's funny, like germ theory is the official one, so that everyone is allowed to kind of eat fast food and be sedentary in front of the television and wait for a vaccine.
Exactly.
And that's some bullshit. But the funny thing is, we live terrain theory, and yet the officialdom is in germ theory. And outside in germ theory, there is no relation between disease and meaning and emotion, which is mental, because everywhere else in the world has had it, including, quote unquote, the West, up until about 300 years ago. Exactly.
And I mean, there's so much to unpack there. I mean, in fact, the degree to which, so what do you want to look at there?
Well, I guess I want to sit with, as we sort of come to the end, a couple of things. I think a way of looking at what terrain theory, or what you were kind of talking about in a Chinese medicine context, we have that here in practice without really thinking about it. So if you look at what is actually best practice now. It's all the things that are contested on MSNBC and shouldn't be, just because you know who said it. But like warmth and sunlight and exercise and a whole foods low carb diet. That's terrain theory. That if you do that, you will not die of this thing. And it doesn't mean that the pathogen itself is non-existent. I think on the show I said I'm 65 terrain, 35 germ. It doesn't mean the pathogen doesn't exist.
Yes.
It means who cares?
Right. It means do everything you can. The author of the Shanghai Lun, Zhang Zhongjing, said that if the qi and blood are ample, no spirit can bother one. Now that means if the qi and blood are ample, the circulation is good, the resources are there, right? So that's the fundamental miracle, is that we can take physical matter into our bodies, transform it into energy, and then transform it back into flesh. I mean, that's the fundamental miracle of the spleen and the stomach, what we call the Tai Yin and the Yang Ming, is the capacity to take in substance and transform it into essences, and then transform those essences back into the physical flesh of our bodies. And that represents our resources. That's the center of our being. And if those resources are ample, then our body condition is our body condition is also healthy, meaning that all of the influences that have come through our ancestors to us now have provided at the root of our being also is well resourced and is grounded in that. Then the resistance, which is at the surface, which is like at the high noon of our movement through life, then things come into contact with our body, and we're capable of resisting them. That's fundamentally the fundamental construct of that is called yin and wei. There is nourishing aspects of physiology, and there are protective aspects of physiology. And like everything else in Chinese, those exist along a continuum. If you create like, so we have yin and yang. Yin and yang is not two things that you see out there. Yin and yang is actually one thing with two poles. So every sort of like so then yin and wei are also two aspects of one thing, two poles of one thing. So there's a constant dance, there's a constant interaction between all of the resources in our body, all the aspects of our body condition, all the aspects of the terrain, inclusive of ancestral influences, inclusive of emotional influences, inclusive of behaviors, inclusive of lifestyle choices that render the terrain susceptible to that movement, to that invasion, and by making the protective aspects of our body weaker. So what we need to do is, right now, the irony there is one of the ways in which those resources are enacted is through community and through bonds. Right, the physical aspect of our body is in a non-physical way manifested through the bonds that we have. The initial source of our resources are literally from the mother, first through the umbilical cord, and then through nursing, and then through caregiving. Minimally egocentric, unconditional love creates the sense of who we are and how worthy we are of being taken care of. And that's our resources. And that's the center of our being. That's where the nourishment comes in. And we have to support that. We have to support that in our lifestyle. We have to support that through what we take into our bodies in order to render our resistance functional.
Yeah, I like it. It's good advice. Do you think, like, going back to the hospital and disease and meaning, I guess, so what's going on at the moment turns out not really to be respiratory, but to be associated with low blood oxygen. So it's cardiovascular, it's hypertension, it's in that world instead. What do you think, like, Again, I'm fascinated by the idea that, because it is principally old people because they have more comorbidities, right?
Mm-hmm.
Uh, I'm fascinated by how meaning was found in the appearance of this collection of symptoms in some way, like China, like in Wuhan, and what is like a Chinese medicine perspective on what are we being called to sit with as
Okay, well, so
right? Do you know what I mean?
I can't speak to that necessarily from a modern day in Wuhan
Sure.
position, but I can tell you what I think. And
Sure.
what I think is that this is informed by the work of Jean Gebser. So I came into contact with the work of Jean Gebser in like 2014 or something, and I'm deeply, deeply involved in it. It took over my life because it's so consistent and so congenial to Chinese medicine. Now within that, we are currently in the throes of the last sort of neoliberal paroxysms of the mental rational sphere, of that which is focused on positivist, materialist cosmology. That corresponds to a state which has reached a peak, and at its peak it should decline, and it is not declining. It is constantly pushing for more, and that means that it's wildly out of control. The yin and yang are separating. The yin and wei are separating as this thing moves on and on out into the world and tries to consume more and consume more and consume more. And on the intellectual sphere, that is the functioning of the mental rational. And it's not descending back to meet its origin. So in Chinese medicine, that's the metal function. The function of metal is to descend, is to take in the substance and transform it into something life-affirming and life-nourishing. And instead, it's taking in compromised substance and striving to create constant growth through compromised substance. And in the context of that, you have this like dry heat that we call electromagnetic frequencies that are equally problematizing that quality. Right? That dryness, the function of extracting substance from matter is drying it. And if you accelerate that, it becomes too dry. And when it becomes too dry, it becomes like tinder, and then it bursts into this cataclysm of fiery overgrowth. Now, that can happen physiologically. If that comes into your experience and then goes through your lungs and ravages the sensitive tissues of your lungs, you get what we've got.
Mm-hmm.
And the only way out of it is that we have to like break that pattern. We have to restore the natural function of descent. The catabasis has to be enacted, because the connection between that metal function and the earth function of that intake becoming nourishing substance, that's part of what's being disrupted. And that's in the Shanghai moon, that's the relationship between the Yang Ming and the Tai Yin. And the Tai Yin is comprised of the function of the digestive system in the spleen, and above that, the Tai Yin is associated with the lung. And so that deep interaction between nourishment and substance and intake and transformation, that's what's being disrupted.
Yeah, I like it. I think that it's fascinating for people who are, obviously it's different if you want to embark on this as a career, but for people who would like to get an appreciation of the worldview, so that like how we could, a different worldview to sit with any particular challenge or even just the world, is there like a really good sort of beginner's book on how to understand perspectives that come out of something like Chinese medicine?
So there's two books that I can recommend like unequivocally. One of them is called Returning to the Source by Zev Rosenberg. The other is the book that I mentioned called Classical Chinese Medicine by Liu Li Hong. And that's a monumental text. And it's not an easy read, but it is one that is consistent to the deepest roots of the medicine, the roots that are connected to the epistemology of Chinese medicine that could be the means by which we transcend this kind of overarch of materialism.
Cool.
It's deeply, it expresses that very deeply. So those two books I highly recommend. Yeah, unequivocally.
Cool. And if would you, I mean, you are, amongst other things, an acupuncturist and so on. For people who, from a client perspective, how do people go about, if they're like, okay, is it symptom based, or is it more like how would you suggest people go about participating, even from a client perspective, in something like this? Is it getting a consult with someone, or what's the kind of most bioavailable process,
right? Well,
for
so
people outside the system?
So, one of the most basic things is, so the answer to that is sure, seek out a practitioner of Chinese medicine, and they will certainly do a thorough, take a thorough inventory of your health and find the ways where those vulnerabilities are present, and help you to shore up shore up those vulnerabilities.
Very cool. Go on.
Oh no, that's it. It's just, as far as I'm concerned, there's just make sure that when you go find that practitioner, that they are not trying to fix something. They're not trying to fix you in the same way that it becomes like, conventional Rockefeller medicine light, but that they see you, and they see you as an individual, and they strive to understand who you are and how you're responding to the world and how you experience the world. Because if one can understand how another experiences the world, the whole host of behaviors that they enact in their responsiveness to life become very clear. And there is nothing to fix. There is only natural function that needs to be brought back into natural function. Every symptom is a message from your body that is communicating to you how to bring yourself back into full expression. Now, you might be, we like to think like, everyone's meant to be like this mighty oak tree, and full expression is like this mighty oak tree on Instagram or whatever. But you could be like the most like cypress at the beach could be your full expression. And there is nothing to fix there. The only thing is to bring you back into contact with that full expression of who you are. That's like really important. Seek a practitioner that views medicine in that way. Because that's the true meaning of non-allopathic. That means that's salutogenic, that acknowledges neurodivergence, that acknowledges equity.
I got into, or kind of pivoted to a terrain and whatever theory perspective from permaculture, because what you just said there, the tree metaphor, right? The goal of regenerative agriculture is to have every organism on your farm fulfill its natural expression. So, and that comes down to how and when your grasslands are consumed by ruminants and so on, because you have to let the grass fulfill its natural expression. Same thing with like how animals are moved, and the whole thing is not. The whole thing is a system, but the underlying philosophy is basically let the 10,000 things be the 10,000 things.
Right. And within that, right, the concept of the zones is like, let the thing express itself in the most appropriate place. Like
Yeah.
that's the terrain, that's the terroir, right? That's like exactly the same thing. Like allow the aspects, all of the different aspects of your function, right? There's a part of you that is 100% made up of every ancestor that you have. Every ancestor you have ever had is present in your body. How are you attending to that? That's an aspect of your nourishment. That's an aspect of your earth. That's the water expressing itself through embodiment. At the same time, the potential arising out of that for the entirety of your life and the potential of the full expression of yourself as an individual in the context of worlding, right? In gold, you know, emerging, always on the verge of full expression, always emerging into being. That's what we want to allow. And that can't be accomplished through a materialist. That cannot be accomplished through a materialist model.
Agreed. And a very good place to end. I hope people were taking notes. And if, people who want to know more about yourself and what's going on, let them know.
Yeah, well, so BrandtStickley.com. And frankly, like a pretty quick, like a quick Google search will lead to any number of little videos of talks that I've given, which are generally pretty accessible descriptions of relatively accessible descriptions of some more details around what we've talked about.
Yeah, absolutely. Splendid.
Yeah.
Well, this is a fantastic and timely chat. I think I think it's medicinal in every sense of the word. So
I should hope.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Very good stuff. Brandt and I were chatting after the show, and he joked that we didn't even get to talk really about animism and spirits yet. But obviously, cosmology, whose first written books are almost 2,000 years old, and even they are a gathering up of much older healing modalities, can't exactly be covered in a 1-hour show. It's fine, because I expect we'll be having a lot more conversations around healing and spirit and so on in the coming months. So we can consider that a part 1. And I'm really happy with our first discussion, because I derive so much personal insight from, I guess we would call it a Kripal-esque approach to comparison, which is, being enriched by encountering other lifeways in a non-extractive way. Consider, for instance, that departure from a state of health is a guaranteed outcome from being at odds with or antagonistic to the flow of life. So it's holistic in a cosmic sense, right? And that's rather than the materialist battlefield approach of single causes with single private remedies available to you at cost, of course, and for the profit of the few, right? One of the topic areas discussed in the Medicine Songs video Brandt and I referenced, which is available if you haven't seen it at my YouTube channel or at runesoup.com, is whether or not you think the state has a monopoly on expertise. And when you hold up the Rockefeller medicine framing that is being imposed on all of us, in comparison to a cosmology that at its ultimate origin has outlasted ice ages and the rise and fall of many empires, I mean, the knee-jerk answer is, well, obviously not. Okay, then sit with what that means for you. How are you adjusting your behaviors and perspectives when you say the state doesn't have a monopoly on expertise? How are you preparing your terrain so that the pathogens of fear and state-inflicted violence and control can get no footholds? How are you arranging your in a landscape so that your mountains are impassable and your deserts too wide for any invader to survive the journey? And how are you preparing your kingdom so that neighboring kingdoms are also not invaded? How are you making sure the enemy dies in your desert and doesn't merely cross it to assault your neighbor's forests? What are your breath practices or your prayer practices? Have you made the world slightly less fearful by the time you go to sleep at night, which should be early and for 8 hours? Do you consider yourself to be an essential fragment of a living universe? If so, then start acting like it. Until next time.